Good morning and welcome. We'll wait a minute or two to get folks joining us. Good morning, everyone. We'll wait a minute to get folks on the line and then we'll start us off. Okay, I'm going to get us started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I just want to say my name is Carolyn Gruber. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Stimson Center's Environmental Security Program. I'm so pleased to be joined by some excellent panelists today, but I'll give a few remarks at the beginning here and then introduce our opening remarks speaker. So this is the first in a two-part webinar about the need for a global plastics treaty. And this is in preparation for the fourth of 5 sessions of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. So the next session, the fourth session, will be in Ottawa later this month. And so we're looking to our panelists here to help illuminate some of the key challenges, some of the opportunities that we are facing in developing this legally binding instrument to deal with plastic pollution. I think it's pretty clear plastic is very simply a part of us. Since the early 1900s, this material of 1,000 uses has become essential to our lives, but at a very steep cost. Plastic pollution is truly all around us, from the depths of the Mariana Trench to the air we breathe in our bodies, food, water, from ridge to reef. So each year, the world produces about 430 million metric tons of plastic, and half of that is designed for a single-use product. So global plastic pollution is expected or could triple by 2040. And so the need for a UN treaty is fairly clear. What we're looking for is to have a clear path toward a future that is free from plastic pollution. And allow me to introduce His Serene Highness, Prince Albert II of Monaco, to begin our conversation today.
Dear Sarah Simpson-Karras, dear Professor Landrigan, dear Sally Ozell, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'd like to thank the Stimson Center for having initiated this discussion on the need for a UN global treaty on plastics and for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I think we all agree that plastics are a key issue of our modern world. They are a key issue given the billion tons of plastic waste that pollute our planet and have extremely serious repercussions not only on the natural ecosystems, but also on the health of all of us. Billions of tons, there are said to be around 6 billion, that's close to 1 ton per human being. The magnitude of this figure is too seldom appreciated, and the consequences are still underestimated. Plastics are also a key issue because they highlight the need for us to initiate a very extensive process, which extends beyond borders and which, to be effective, should involve a large number of players, economic players in particular, even though their immediate interests are rarely aligned to this concept, at least in appearance, if it is based on short-term reasoning. Finally, this issue is key because it highlights the need for us to create a more sustainable world. Due to their importance in our lifestyles, our production methods, and our consumption patterns, plastics sadly play a major role in our civilization. Eliminating problematic plastics and stopping leaks of plastic waste into the environment is therefore a complex process which can be done in different ways at different stages of the plastic life cycle. By legally banning the most dangerous of them, by avoiding to use them, like the single-use ones, whatever the consequences on our daily lives, by promoting a new circular economy for plastics, and by replacing them with new materials and new behaviors. The complexity of the change to realize requires a broad coalition of stakeholders, political leaders, of course, with a strong willingness, but also scientists for guidance, and industrial players who are essential to the invention of alternative solutions which could allow us to prevent pollution and preserve biodiversity. In the short term, there is a need for a specific mobilization on the negotiations underway in the framework of the United Nations. In this purpose, Monaco has joined with the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, a group of more than 60 countries from every continent who will be taking part in the next round of talks to be held in Ottawa at the end of this month. This negotiation is difficult, let's not hide it. This is why, while encouraging for a positive outcome, we must also pursue resolute action at the national levels. In Monaco, a series of measures have been taken focused mainly on banning or limiting single-use plastics and encouraging their substitution with sustainable solutions. However, these local measures alone are still not enough, and we need to work on improving them constantly because plastics are everywhere. At the regional level, the BMed initiative was launched over 5 years ago in order to diversify solutions and help identify promising ideas. It selects and supports innovative projects to combat plastic pollution across the entire Mediterranean region. Initiated by MA Foundation in partnership with the Tara Ocean Foundation, Surfrider Foundation Europe, the MAVA Foundation, and IUCN, BMed has allocated close to 1.5 million euros so far to support 92 projects in 15 different Mediterranean countries. In addition to the financial aid provided to local projects, BMed facilitates the sharing of experiences, good practices, and the replication of effective solutions. It also brings together a dozen major corporations in a committee whose work is to study and promote sustainable substitution solutions. Faced with the scourge of plastics, we need to explore every avenue, try every solution, and leverage every skill. That is why today's discussion is important, and that's why I'm delighted to be taking part and to assure you of my unwavering support. Thank you.
That was a perfect entryway into our discussion today. So I'll take a few minutes to introduce our panel of experts. I'll do it in the order of their presentations, and I'll do it really quickly so that we can get to their work and get to a good conversation later. So first we have Dr. Monica Arienzo. Dr. Arienzo is an associate research professor in the Division of Hydrologic Sciences at the Desert Research Institute, and she works on chemical tools and how to understand how humans impact the environment, including through microplastics. Second, we'll have Dr. Philip Landrigan, who's the director of the Global Observatory on Planetary Health in Boston College. Dr. Landrigan directs the program for global public health and the common good at Boston College, and his research examines the impacts on children's health of toxic environmental hazards. And third, we have Ms. Stacy Meng. Ms. Meng is the policy director for North America at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and she focuses on the role that government and policy can play in accelerating the transition to a circular economy that can deliver better outcomes for people and the environment. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Arienzo to give us a little overview, and then we'll move on. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Carolyn. And now I'm going to share my screen. And so today, to kick us off, I'm going to start by just talking about the environmental implications from plastic pollution and why such an instrument is really important to helping us reduce these environmental impacts. And so this photo I'm showing here is a photo of Phnom Penh, the capital city in Cambodia. And we're looking from the Mekong River towards Phnom Penh. And the reason why I love this photo is it captures one of the main things that we consider when we think about plastic pollution. And that's this very rapid growth that we're seeing in the city of Phnom Penh, but also more broadly in Cambodia. So you can see these high-rise buildings being built, and we have this amazing development in this city, which comes with these issues like plastic pollution. And I'll be talking more about that. But before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge our collaborators, especially Wonders of the Mekong, which is a USAID-funded project based in Cambodia, where this group, Wonders of the Mekong, is studying the biodiversity of the Mekong River. And what this group recognized early on is that when they're studying the biodiversity of the Mekong River in Cambodia, they can't ignore plastic pollution. And so that's why we were brought in to look at the plastic pollution in Cambodia. One of the first things I want to highlight is that plastics are a complex pollutant. Whether you're looking at it from my perspective and the environmental aspects of plastic pollution, or in developing an instrument like the UN treaty, or when you are studying health effects, it's really important we bear in mind that plastics are very complicated. So here we have the 6 commonly produced plastics. You can see some of the ways in which these plastics are, what they're made into. But you can also see the chemistry here, and the chemistry of these different plastics is really important to keep in mind. From my perspective, someone who studies plastic in the environment, the chemistry impacts how the plastic will impact and interact with the environment. So for example, some plastics will be floating in the environment and some will be sinking in our water systems. And so this is really important from a sampling standpoint when we go to study this plastics in the environment, but also from the perspective of when we return to the laboratory, want to do laboratory analyses. And it's also important that we think about how we regulate these plastics, because each plastic may have different toxicities and may have different ways they're interacting with biota. And so this is just to help set the stage for the complexity of the issue that we're trying to address in my research, but also globally in this UN treaty. I'll be giving you a case study today from my work in Cambodia. But this is meant to just serve as an example of the issue of plastic pollution in the environment. Today I'll be talking about work we're doing on the Mekong River Basin. And if you're not familiar, the Mekong River is outlined in blue in this map, with the basin itself highlighted in this sort of gray color. The work I'll be sharing today is from Cambodia, and we'll be looking at the Mekong River, but then also the tributaries that flow into the Mekong River. The first thing that really struck me when we started this work, as we were sort of boating around in the Mekong River and its tributaries, was the presence of plastic pollution along the shorelines of these rivers. So this is during the dry season when the water levels are low. And what we're seeing here is the disposal of litter along the river banks of these rivers. And then in the wet season, as the water level rises, the litter is then transported downstream. And so how did we get here? Well, in Cambodia, we have, as I already mentioned, this rapid growth that's occurring, both physically, right, as I showed at the beginning, but also as far as population growth. We have also tied, at the same time of that rapid population growth, we also have increase in globally of plastic production and plastic usage. And so in Cambodia, we're seeing this increase in population, increase in plastic usage, but we also have this escape of litter into the environment as a result of there being no centralized waste management system outside of the city of Phnom Penh. And so this has basically created this perfect storm to allow this disposal of this plastics in the environment like we're seeing here. And these are some other photos just showing kind of what we see as we are traveling around in the Mekong River Basin. This has also resulted in other means for litter disposal. So here we're seeing trash burning, and we do in fact find in many of our samples pieces of burned plastic. And so that suggests that as they're burning plastic or as they're burning their litter, this still is escaping into the environment. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we've been collaborating with Wonders of the Mekong, and this is a group that's been studying the biodiversity of the Mekong River Basin. And one of the ways in which they've been studying the biodiversity is by looking at these dive fisheries, which are these stationary trawl net fisheries. And these are located on the Tonle Sap that feed into the Mekong River. The Tonle Sap River, this is an incredibly biodiverse fishery. It's a very productive fishery. And what Wonders of the Mekong realized was that they couldn't study the biodiversity of this fishery without also studying plastic pollution. And so PhD student Seila Che, who's doing her PhD at the Royal University in Cambodia, has really taken the lead in understanding this relationship between the fisheries and the plastic pollution that we're seeing. And so just to further highlight this, this is a video from our rural fishery. So this is located in kind of a more rural environment on the Tonle Sap. And you can just see the amount of fish that they're catching. This is generally a haul after 1 hour. And you can just see the amount of fish they're collecting. This is also an incredibly diverse catch. And so you can see this is a much more healthy system in this part of the Tonle Sap River. Now moving closer to the city of Phnom Penh, this is our urban site. And here you can see the fish catch is very different. We see a lot more plastic pollution being caught by the fishermen. And in fact, so Selah has been studying this. And what she does is she sends out teams to this rural site and to our urban site. She's collecting the plastic pollution, weighing it, and assessing the type of litter that we're finding in these nets. And what she finds is that this dichotomy of what I just showed you in the video is fairly consistent with time, where we see our rural site has much less plastic by weight. It's about 1% of the total haul weight. And then on the urban site, the plastic by weight is on average 25% of the total haul weight. So we see this variation from rural to urban just in this system in Cambodia. The other thing we find is that litter in these hauls are dominated by single-use plastics. In particular, we find a lot of plastic bags. We also find cups and then food wrappers as well. And so why do we care? Well, we care about studying this plastic pollution because of not only because of the plastic pollution itself, but then also because of the downstream impacts that these macroplastics can have. So these large pieces of plastics can break down to form smaller and smaller pieces of plastic, to microplastics, which are sizes of a bacteria to nanoplastics, which can be the size of viruses or smaller. These plastics can also break down and release other chemicals. For example, chemicals can be added during the manufacturing of those plastics that then can be released into the environment. And so this is just to highlight further the complexities of the environmental impacts of plastics, and we need to continue to do studies to understand these impacts. And so another University of Nevada, Reno PhD student, Rachel Kozlowski, who I also mentor, is also looking at microplastics in the Mekong River in Cambodia, so these small pieces of plastic. And she's studying these plastics throughout the entire length of the Mekong in Cambodia, so from the border with Laos to the border of Vietnam. And so at the end of the day, as I've highlighted here, plastic pollution is a global issue, and I've demonstrated one case study from Cambodia in which we've been looking at this spatial variation of what we see in plastic pollution just in one system. And so while this is a really complex issue and there's a lot of various factors we need to consider, from disposal to removal to monitoring, I think at the end of the day, the most important aspect we keep in mind is essentially turning off the tap of plastic production and reducing leakage into the environment. And so I'm really, heartened by this UN treaty discussion that we're having today and this UN treaty in general, because I think it's really important as we move forward towards reducing plastic inputs into our environment. And so with that, thank you. And if we don't have a chance to get to your question, you're welcome to also email me, and I'll pass it off to the next speaker.
Thanks so much. Dr. Landrigan, I think this is your turn. Wait, before you start, definitely make sure you go off mute because we want to hear you for sure. Oh, we can't quite hear you yet. There we go. Perfect.
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
Right, there we go. I think after 2 years of COVID, I know how to operate PowerPoint. So how to operate Zoom. So thank you. Thank you, Monica, for that great introduction showing us that plastic pollutes the biosphere. Now, as a medical doctor, I want to take it the next step and talk about how that plastic that has become so ubiquitous in our environment is actually affecting human health. It's not just stuff that's out there in the environment. It's not just pollution that's far away. It's here in us, in our kids, and it's causing disease here and now. And that's really the main point of my presentation this morning. So let's ask ourselves the rhetorical question, why do we need a global plastics treaty? Well, firstly, as Prince Albert said, as Monica affirmed, 6 billion tons of plastic waste pollutes the planet. And it's not just environmental waste. It gets into us. It causes disability. It causes disease. It causes premature death at every stage of the plastic life cycle. And it's also worth noting from the policy perspective that these diseases are very expensive. We've estimated that they cost $1.2 trillion per year, and that those costs are offloaded by the plastic industry onto citizens, onto governments in countries around the world. There's also social injustice involved, and the harms of plastic, the diseases and the economic costs fall disproportionately on the world's poorest, most vulnerable people, minoritized people, and the smallest states. And we're not going to be able to recycle our way out of the problem, at least not in 2024, because plastic recycling rates have remained stubbornly low. They're below 10% globally. Despite a lot of hype, current plastics resist recycling. It's not that people don't care. It's not that people don't try to put their waste plastic in the right place. The problem is that the plastic itself resists recycling, and the stuff therefore accumulates across the planet. And finally, plastic production is on track to double by 2040, to triple by 2060. These are the key reasons why, in my opinion, we need a global plastics treaty. So just a few quick reviews of the environmental contamination caused by plastic. Monica has already said this so very well. Pollutes beaches, it pollutes cities. This is Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I think many of you have seen this iconic picture from the World Wildlife Fund of what plastic waste is doing in the ocean and to the creatures that live in the ocean. So I had the privilege the last few years to chair the Minderoo-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, supported by the Minderoo Foundation in Australia and by the Scientific Center of Monaco in Monaco. And the main goal of our commission was to make the invisible visible, to fully quantify plastics costs, the health costs, the cost to the environment, the cost to the environment, and the costs in terms of social justice. And to look not just at plastic waste. We see plastic waste and plastic pollution as the visible tip of the iceberg. But when we think about plastic, we need to understand that the waste that we see, like in this terrible picture from Ghana, is just the end of the pipeline. And there's a whole system of production and use and movement of plastic that precedes this end stage. And there is disease and death associated with every one of those stages. So a quick primer, and this will follow up on what Monica has already said about what plastics are. Plastics are manufactured chemical materials. 99% of plastic comes from fossil carbon, from coal, from oil, from gas. In the USA, it's mostly gas these days. In places like China, it's mostly coal. But in any event, fossil carbon is the rootstock. And that makes the polymer. These long bands that you see across here are the polymer. Polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, polyethylene, etc. Those are the polymers that give plastic its structure. Then there are thousands of chemicals, latest count 16,000 chemicals that are added to plastic to give it various properties, to make it flexible, to give it color, to enable it to resist ultraviolet light, and many more. And these chemicals include lots of toxins. They include carcinogenic chemicals that cause cancer, neurotoxicants that damage the brain and nervous system, endocrine disruptors that interfere with fetal development, brain development, development of the reproductive organs. And most of these chemicals, the overwhelming majority, 80% or more, have never been tested for toxicity. They're simply put into plastics on a wing and a prayer, with the chemical industry hoping they don't cause harm and letting somebody else take care of the problem if there is harm. And those additives don't stay in the plastic. They leach out of the polymer matrix. They get into the environment. They get into people. And it's those chemicals that are responsible for many of plastic's harms. So as I've already presaged, our commission looked at plastics hazards across the whole life cycle, starting with feedstock extraction and then moving through transport of the coal, the gas, the oil, and the feedstock chemicals, the actual manufacture of the plastic, its use, its recycling, such as it is, which isn't much, its disposal into the environment, its burning. You saw that picture that Monica showed of the burning of plastic waste in the gully leading down into the Mekong River, and shipment overseas. A lot of what gets counted as recycling, we need to understand, is actually shipped overseas, but the box is ticked that that's recycled because it's out of sight, out of mind. And then finally, we need to remember that plastic production is very energy intensive. It has a big carbon footprint. It's responsible today for almost 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that percentage is increasing. And the current carbon footprint of plastic production is greater than the annual contribution of Brazil. Just a few pictures of this cycle. Here we are fracking up in North Dakota. And you can see that fracking is a massive enterprise. It takes place often in rural areas. A lot of us have never seen it up close, but it is very destructive to the environment. It spills out multiple chemicals. The workers who work in these operations are at risk of disease, injury, and death, and the people in the surrounding communities are exposed to the same chemicals in the workplace. Then when the gas and the oil are pulled out of the ground, or when they're transformed into chemicals, those materials need to be transported by rail, by boat, by truck, and sometimes things go awry. And this is what happened last year in East Palestine, Ohio, when the plastic chemical vinyl chloride was being carried on tanker trucks, the tanker rail cars. The cars overturned, and there was a huge fire. And then plastic manufacture in plants that look like oil refineries because they're closely akin to oil refineries, and they release chemicals into the workplace where they expose the workers, and they release those chemicals into the surrounding environment, which almost always are poor, minority, vulnerable communities like this fence line community in Louisiana. And environmental injustice is the consequence. Then there are the hazards that are associated with plastic use. When we, our kids, come into contact with plastics, the chemicals that are in these beautiful little blocks leach out, they get into kids, and kids are especially vulnerable because of their hand-to-mouth behavior, their play close to the ground. All of those factors magnify children's exposure. And we now know through careful epidemiologic study that the chemicals that are in plastics, the chemicals that I've listed here, such as bisphenol A and phthalates, flame retardants, PFAS, and many others, cause disease and death at every stage of human life, from earliest pregnancy through to old age. And I've listed some of the many negative health impacts on this slide. Speaking as a pediatrician, I want to emphasize that infants in the womb and young children are particularly vulnerable to plastics chemicals. And that's because in early development, organs are being formed very rapidly through incredibly complex processes. And the price of that great complexity is great vulnerability. And we now understand that toxic chemicals in plastic can cause damage to infants at levels far below the levels that would cause harm to any of us on this webinar today. And they can cause brain damage, they can cause birth defects, they can cause cancer. The brain damage can result in loss of intelligence, as measured by decreased IQ, attention deficit disorder, and autism. And we know that there are just no safe exposure thresholds for chemical exposure in adult life. And the only rational approach to dealing with this, therefore, is prevention. And finally, so got to point out that these effects can last lifelong. They don't just cause disease in childhood, but they cause disruption in cells. They cause epigenetic changes that interfere with the expression of DNA. And these changes can resonate across the lifespan to increase risk for brain disease, heart disease, diabetes in childhood, in young adult life, and through to old age. Just very recently, within the past month, a striking publication came out in the New England Journal of Medicine a month and a day ago, showing that microplastic particles may be associated with cardiovascular disease in adults in Italy. The researchers in Italy looked at 312 patients. These patients underwent a surgical procedure called carotid endarterectomy. This is a picture of the carotid artery, and this is a picture of a plaque, an atherosclerotic plaque inside the artery. Endarterectomy is a procedure by which a catheter is placed up into the artery, and it scrapes around like a roto-rooter and removes this plaque. It's a surgery that's done when the carotid artery is in the neck, supplies blood to the brain, and this procedure is done in people that are having strokes or transient ischemic attacks or are at high risk of stroke. It's done to open up the vessels and protect the brain against arteriosclerosis. And what these researchers did was that they removed this plaque tissue here. Here's the plaque from 312 people. They found that 58% of these people had microplastics and nanoplastic particles in their plaque. And here's the striking finding, that people that had plaque had a 4.5-fold increase in risk for heart disease, stroke, or death over the next 3 years compared to people in this population who had no micro and nanoplastics. Now, I hasten to add that this is only one study, therefore it does not prove causation, but it's very worrisome. I have no doubt that it'll be replicated, and it immediately makes me ask the question, what other organs are affected? Do microplastics get into the brain? Do they get into the reproductive organs? What other mischief do they cause in the human body? So this is a story that's evolving. Keep an eye on it. In the Minder-Monaco Commission, we had a team of economists led by Professor Maureen Cropper of the University of Maryland, who analyzed the costs of the diseases caused by plastic. On the left side are the damages calculated globally of plastic production. On the right-hand side, looking only at one country, the United States, the costs of the diseases caused by plastics. Adding these two circular figures up, it comes up to $1.2 billion per year. This is almost certainly a low estimate, given that the damage calculations were done for only one country. The true number is probably a multiple of that number. And as I've said already, those costs are offloaded by the chemical and plastic manufacturing industry onto citizens and governments. Environmental injustice is pervasive at every stage of the plastic life cycle. Transportation in East Palestine, Ohio, and waste sites in Nigeria, and as you've seen a few minutes ago, Cambodia. So here's the main driver. This is why plastic production is getting so much worse so quickly. Exponential increases in plastic production from no more than about 2 tons in 1950 to over 400 million tons today, on track to double by 2040, triple by 2060. And the thing that is driving this incredible increase in the production of plastic is a pivot by the fossil fuel industry. They recognize that the market for burning coal, for burning gas, for burning oil is going down, taking the long view. People are going green. And therefore, they have come up with this strategy of converting gas and oil and coal into single-use plastic that gets used once, that gets thrown away, that generates great profits for them and great harm for the rest of us. And this is really the central issue that we must confront as we go into the next round of negotiations of the Plastics Treaty. So I think the time has come when we really have to move courageously and yet intelligently to deal with the plastics crisis. Clearly, some plastics are essential and we must retain them, but a lot of plastics are unnecessary, they're stupid, and we can do without them. And we have to have the wisdom to distinguish between the two. We don't know everything about plastic, but we know a lot. And we certainly cannot use the lack of complete knowledge as an excuse to take no action. That's why we need to do a treaty. And I would argue strongly, and this was the position of the Intergovernmental Commission, that the centerpiece of this treaty, the foundation, needs to be a global cap on plastic production, supported by targets, by timetables, with global harmonization and national commitments. Reduction of plastics harm by recycling is a laudable goal. I'm certainly a big supporter of recycling, but plastic recycling, as I mentioned, is less than 10%, way below paper, cardboard, glass, or aluminum. Right now, it's a laudable goal, but it's an empty promise. We cannot rely upon it to control the problem. We can't recycle our way out of the plastics crisis. We need to put a cap on production. So thanks very much. I'll now turn the screen back over to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me pull these videos back over. Excellent. Okay, so hi, as mentioned, I am Daisy Ming. I am the Director of Policy for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in North America. If you're not familiar, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is an organization, a nonprofit working to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. EMF has been working in the circular economy and plastic space for many years. We've published a handful of reports on the topic, and kind of what those reports have revealed, is that the current system is hugely wasteful. So one of our reports found that 95% of the value of plastic packaging material is lost to the economy each year through pathways that you see on the screen, but it's landfilled, it's leaked into the environment, it's incinerated, lost in any variety of ways, which is hugely problematic for the reasons that we've heard in the earlier presentations, right? The impacts on the environment and human health when folks are exposed to plastics. But research has shown that circular economy can be a solution to many of these problems. So we have seen, kind of compared to 2040, if we pursue a business as usual path versus a circular path, we can work towards reducing the annual volume of plastics entering our oceans by 80%. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, generate $200 billion in savings each year, and then also generate 700,000 net new jobs. So the circular economy holds a lot of promise. And I guess maybe I'll stay here. To be clear, when I'm talking about a circular economy, at least from Ellen MacArthur Foundation's perspective, a circular economy is a system where materials never become waste and nature is regenerated. So in a circular economy, products and materials are kept in circulation through processes like maintenance and reuse, refurbishment, remanufacture, recycling, and composting. The circular economy is based on 3 principles, all driven by design, meaning these 3 principles have to show up in the upstream stages of a product's life cycle, not just a waste-facing solution, but we need to eliminate waste and pollution, circulate products and materials at their highest value, and regenerate nature. By applying the principles of a circular economy, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has established kind of a vision for what a circular economy could look like, including plastic packaging. So here are the 6 characteristics. We would need to eliminate problematic and unnecessary packaging, apply reuse models where they are relevant, ensure all packaging is 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable in design, like by design, but also in practice, which is critically important. And then the use of plastic is fully decoupled from the consumption of finite resources, and all packaging is free of hazardous chemicals, and the health, safety, and rights of everyone involved are protected. So in order to kind of execute on this vision, which is quite a lofty vision that we see, and capture the opportunity presented by a circular economy, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, together with the UN Environment Program, established the Global Commitment, which in 2018 it launched. It mobilized over 1,000 organizations, resulting in investments of $10 billion. And the organizations mobilized included businesses and governments, but the businesses cover 20% of the global packaging market. So kind of a high group of a high impact group of folks agreeing to kind of a transparent process, common definitions, annual reporting, and then shared very ambitious goals for 2025 related to that vision. So goals around ensuring 100% reusable, recyclable, compostable, and increasing the share of post-consumer recycled content, decreasing virgin plastic use, et cetera. So we've got the global commitment. Again, we're now kind of 5 years into that. It launched in 2018. And we have seen that through the global commitment that voluntary action is hugely important and can have a big impact. Based on the reporting, we've seen that not only does the kind of voluntary business action unlock a lot of change, but it also has impacts outside of even the signatory group. But just, and I put up here on the slide a visual of some of the impacts we've seen from the top performers of the global commitment. This is the information I had at the ready. The numbers are impressive across the board. But as it's important to acknowledge the success that the global commitment has had and the progress that we've made, it's also important to acknowledge that we likely won't meet all of the targets that were set in 2018 by 2025. And we have learned that we need a lot more and a lot more ambitious binding policy measures and accelerated voluntary business action in order to kind of achieve the vision of a circular economy that we have laid out and that we aspire to. In particular, what we really need is to replicate scale and mandate the solutions that businesses have convincingly proven and demonstrated are actually possible and helpful. And then we also need to overcome some pivotal hurdles that we've identified around scaling reuse, flexible plastic packaging in high leakage countries, and then also a lack of infrastructure for collecting and circulating packaging, which I think should resonate and resonate with what we've heard from the earlier presenters. And kind of some of the challenges that make this so difficult and make these hurdles so difficult to overcome are the need for kind of investment dollars and infrastructure. We need investment in both infrastructure and innovation to overcome some of these challenges. And then the other piece that I've already kind of touched on is this is a group of 20% of, representing 20% of the global packaging market. That means 80% of the global packaging market is not necessarily on board with our vision for a circular economy and not working towards this. So we need to see a bit more of a mandatory piece to get the rest of the market involved. This is the second half of the slide that I had up a minute ago, but kind of what the global commitment companies are doing. So companies who have agreed to lead on this versus what the global market has done on the same metrics. And we're looking at, decreasing use of virgin plastic, eliminating problematic and unnecessary packaging. And as you can see, the businesses who have tried to make progress have made progress, but the global market hasn't followed. And so we really need a global instrument to kind of level the playing field and drive the global market to match what we know companies and businesses are capable of. And it's particularly difficult for businesses and making this a global problem. We've seen because companies operate in a lot of countries, even when we have a country by country requirements. I think we heard earlier, that local solutions aren't enough. We have large multinational corporations that have complex supply chains and complicated compliance mechanisms, but we also have small and medium-sized enterprises that are struggling to understand their compliance obligations and meet the trade requirements and share information across their supply chains as well. So we see a global treaty as kind of a solution to help us there to accelerate and coordinate and align all of the national policies that are popping up towards a kind of common global strategic direction. We think a global treaty can create the right enabling conditions to get the investment needed to scale the change that we need to see and do it quickly. We also think it can level the playing field. And so seeing the global treaty as a big opportunity, EMF is actively working on the treaty and advocating, but also we, together with WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, have convened the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, which is a group of over 200 businesses across the plastics value chain, as well as financial institutions and NGOs that are asking for an ambitious UN treaty to bring plastics into a circular economy and stop them from becoming waste. The Business Coalition businesses, which include major brands that you've heard of, I'm glad to kind of talk about who's there or share a link to the Business Coalition website. But they're looking for a legally binding treaty that tackles the entire life cycle of plastic products underpinned by harmonized legislation. So I think more ambitious than many would have expected from businesses. And just briefly looking forward to INC4. I think we're excited to see what the negotiators are able to accomplish. This has been a difficult negotiation process, and I think we expect it to continue to be a difficult negotiating process. At a high level, what I'm prioritizing going into INC4 are kind of critical elements that we think we can make progress on, and we see having the greatest potential to deliver change as soon as possible. So those are restrictions and phase outs, reuse policies, product design requirements, extended producer responsibility, and waste management. A mouthful, glad to dig into any of those specifically if folks have questions, but we'll be focused, worth emphasizing on accelerating reuse. We think that's critical to the success of building a circular economy for plastics, and it needs to be a focus of the global treaty. The last two things I'll note is when looking to INC4, we'll expect this treaty to start taking kind of a start and strengthen approach. So given the limited time we have left to negotiate the treaty, we're really focused on making progress on places where there is alignment, maybe starting with plastic packaging and leaving the opportunity to expand the scope of the treaty. And then we'll be keeping an eye on other key issues like a just transition and the impacts on SMEs to ensure that the treaty has adequate support. So with that, I've rattled through my notes, and I'll put up my contact information again if we don't have an opportunity to get to all questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all so much for this excellent conversation. I have a few questions from the audience that I'll start with. I'm going to try to merge some of them because I think there's a few different flavors of conversation we want to have here today. So for some of these, they're looking to the next negotiating session. So this is in April in Ottawa. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hoping will come out of INC4 and what you're a little worried about? Why don't we start with Dr. Landrigan?
Well, I would really hope for a global cap on plastic production to be the backbone of the treaty. I think I certainly applaud in principle everything that Daisy has said about the harnessing the potential for recycling and changing material feedstocks and producing plastics that can be reused. But my understanding of the chemistry, my understanding of the current scene is that that's still very much potential. I applaud the work that's going into it, the investment that's going into it. I don't see that in any way as incompatible with a cap. But I think if we try to rely solely on new and still unproven technologies to get us out of the current bind, we're not going to get out of it. We need the cap. The cap will be what's referred to in the world of occupational health standards in places like OSHA. OSHA talks about what they call a technology forcing standard, a standard that forces the adoption of new technologies. And I see a cap as a way to force plastic producers to produce saner plastics that can indeed be recycled, can indeed be reintroduced into the economy, that may very well have to come from feedstocks other than fossil carbon. So that's my great overarching hope. I also share many of the downstream hopes that Daisy mentioned: extended producer responsibility, much more transparency on the chemicals that go into plastics. We know so little about so many of them, but the cap is the big one.
That's super helpful. Daisy, what about you? What are you worried about? What are you hopeful for?
Yeah. Me personally, outside of EMF, I can speak to EMF's position on this, but I think a global cap would be really great to drive the action that you're talking about, certainly. But at the same time, I think the challenge we face is that these are really difficult negotiations going into INC4 with, how many months? 8 months left to negotiate a global instrument. We are not seeing alignment around that. And so the question is kind of how can we get to a point of agreement? And going into INC4, my hope is, I think I've kind of hit on the topics that I'll be looking at, but I think the hope is that we'll come out of INC4 having actually made some significant progress with a path forward. We will come with a revised draft that is actually workable, and even kind of before we get out of INC4, we really need something that we can negotiate line by line, which is not the current draft that we're working on. So certainly agree that there is an upstream need here, and the question is just how can we mobilize the right players, and mostly the right member states, to agree to a treaty. So my hope is for INC4 is that we'll kind of get some clarity on folks' positions, and we'll make some progress on what the treaty could actually look like, what the text could actually look like. And my worry is that we won't, I guess, is the other side of that. But yeah, I'll pass it maybe to Monica.
Yeah, I think the zero draft text has a lot of brackets, so there's a lot of wiggle room, as we can hopefully say. So it sounds like narrowing it down to some more concrete position setting at INC4 is really what we need to look for. Monica, do you have anything to say?
I don't have much to add, but I do want to highlight, reduction in plastic production. And I think the safety part is really important that we keep in mind. And that's already been highlighted twice by both panelists. But yeah, the importance of the safety from the production and then recycling and just the chemicals that are added also, that's something I'm really hopeful will continue to be included as we move forward.
Absolutely. I think some of the safety concerns that Dr. Landrigan laid out are really, really, truly alarming. So we have a couple of questions here about about scaling up reuse and infrastructure to facilitate reuse. Can anyone speak to that and how we might do that in the future?
Yeah, well, there's certainly investment and energy going into reuse. And the problem is not with people's good intentions. The problem is with the plastics themselves. Different polymers cannot readily be commingled in recycling. And the fact that plastics are loaded with thousands of chemicals, many of which are toxic, means that recycled products are simply not suitable for lots of uses. You can't use recycled plastic for food wrapping. You can't use it for children's toys because it's got too many toxic materials. So I applaud the concept of recycling. I applaud the concept of reuse. But I think that trying to get ourselves out of the current crisis with recycling and reuse is like trying to get out of the climate crisis by using the unproven technology of carbon capture, which is also pushed very, very hard by the petrochemical industry. The last thing the petrochemical industry wants is for any reduction in the global production of plastic, because that threatens their fundamental business model. That's why they'll fight tooth and nail against a cap and advance complicated concepts of recycling. But I think that the negotiators have to have some courage here, and they have to look to the climate treaty as a model. The climate treaty said we are going to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. We're going to shut off the tap. And I think that's the model that has to be paramount in Ottawa. I'm clear-eyed about this. I'm not Pollyanna, and I understand we're a long way from that, but I think that's where we need to be.
I think setting lofty goals is the key here, but it's going to be tricky with the state of the negotiations at the moment.
It will be tricky, but at the end of the day, if we want to preserve our planet, we need to act courageously. 20 years ago, people would have said that the Paris Climate Treaty was not possible.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think
Go
Can I
ahead.
jump in, Carolyn?
Yeah, of course.
Just on the reuse point and also responding on the Paris Agreement, I think our hope is that this treaty will not rely on national action plans to the same degree, and that there will be something kind of in the text on reuse in particular, and building out and scaling up the infrastructure for reuse. What we see there, and EMF has recently published a report on this, EMF being the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, so I'll be glad to drop a link in the chat. But reuse has been demonstrated to actually offer kind of the environmental, economic, and social opportunities that we would hope it would, but it has to be designed really well. And one of the ways that we think you can drive that through a treaty or through national legislation is through targets, and that will, having kind of global targets or national targets for reuse, enable businesses to kind of come together and invest in the infrastructure. And really the way that reuse works best is through shared infrastructure and kind of standardized packaging, right? To kind of get the scale, the economies of scale that will make reuse a viable business model in a lot of ways. So that is something that we see as super important to kind of incentivize through the global treaty.
Dr. Arienzo, do you have anything to add, or shall we move on to another question?
I don't have anything to add. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I have a couple questions lined up here. One is kind of looking to the comparison of durable plastics versus single-use plastics. How do we think the treaty will approach these two different flavors of plastics?
Well, I think if there's a global cap, single-use plastics are the low-hanging fruit. And if there were to be a cap on plastic production, then strong targets on limiting the use of single-use plastics are the place to begin. You know, as I'm a medical doctor, I practiced medicine all my adult life, and there's lots of ways in which plastic is essential to the practice of medicine. Think of intravenous, think of endotracheal tubes, all kinds of surgical instruments. We can't do without plastics, and no rational person would want us to get away from plastics. But the thing we can do without are plastic bags, plastic straws, plastic cutlery, plastic cups. We could impose a global cap and coupled with national commitments, and then intelligent countries would choose to get rid of the single-use stuff, which is clogging up the landfills of the world, and concentrate on producing the durables. The path is clear. I understand it's very, very complex. I understand the negotiations get terribly bogged down in details, but we need a clear vision here.
Any of the other panelists want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, for me, this is just a start and strengthen piece. So we start with what we know is a problem, low-hanging fruit, and we look for the treaty to evolve over time.
Yeah.
Monica, sorry.
Yeah, that perfect segue into what I wanted to add is, I think one of the aspects of the treaty I think is really great is the monitoring aspects, right? And trying to identify these problem plastics. So building exactly on what Daisy was saying is, exactly that, like identifying, what are these problem plastics? Because they are going to be variable in different locations. And that's what, the data we collect looks for and demonstrates is it's not the same story everywhere. We do see slight differences in different locations.
That's a really good thing and a perfect segue to my next question about capacity building. So as with most UN treaties, there are elements of capacity building in the zero draft text. What can you tell me about your hopes for capacity building efforts through the treaty?
Well, clearly we need more monitoring of all sorts of environmental media. And another type of monitoring that's proven very useful in the small number of countries that do it is measuring levels of plastics, chemicals in the bodies of people. Here in the United States, the CDC has the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NHANES, where they routinely take blood samples, urine samples from several thousand people across the United States every year. They're routinely turning up between 200 and 300 manufactured chemicals, most of them plastics chemicals, in all of us, in every one of us on this webinar. Probably have a couple of hundred plastics chemicals in our bodies today. So that kind of monitoring and the making public of the data that emerge from those efforts is very important, and it enable without monitoring, without data, it's awfully hard to chart your progress towards targets.
That's a good component. Anything else related to capacity building?
See that as hugely important. We think that this is something that will kind of come up. I think the US in particular is looking at the financial mechanism as a way to make this whole treaty kind of function. And so excited to see it. It's critical. I mean, you know, as Monica said, everyone is starting in a different place. But no further comment here.
I think one aspect of capacity building is also kind of on the awareness and education aspect of kind of thinking capacity building in a broader sense. And I was, happy to see that that was also included as part of it, because I do think that that continued education is part of building capacity and kind of building awareness and strengthening the treaty.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're at our time here. I want to do a quick plug for our next webinar, which is next Monday, April 15th. We'll be discussing more about the UN treaty and its as we prepare for the next negotiating session in Ottawa. I want to take a quick minute to thank all of our wonderful panelists for helping to kind of really set our sights on something that can be achieved at our next negotiating sessions, and to kind of really illuminate some of the key issues and unknowns about these concerning plastics throughout our lives. I think, as Dr. Landrigan mentioned, it's certainly there are some essential components of plastics, but there's some low-hanging fruit that we can take care of, I think. So I want to say thank you to Monica, Daisy, and Phil, and of course, His Serene Highness, Prince Albert II of Monaco, for joining us today. I'm sure that this will be up on our website in short order if you want to take a look and check out any of the slides. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate your participation and all of the questions. Thank you.